In this video, I want to just cover polygroups as it relates to creating clean topology for characters. There's plenty of other uses for polygroups as well that are fantastic. In this case, I've just sort of taken a sort of stock scene here. This is actually created with Z-spheres. So Z-spheres is another method if you want to create a character. I haven't really covered it too much because I don't find it as good at creating a base mesh for me personally, but Z-spheres, plenty of people use it. It's a great tool, and you can actually preview this mesh. So I'm hitting the A key, by the way, to demonstrate that. But if you notice, if you hit Shift F, which is the polyframe button, so that's the polyframe button that sits right over here. That polyframe button allows you to basically see polygroups. So even in Z-spheres, when you go from one sphere to another, it creates basically a colored grouping. So I'll switch back to this mesh. So when I basically created a mesh snapshot of that, it has colored groupings. Now in the previous video, we were doing things like dynamesh. So I'm going to just make this a poly mesh. And let's say we dynamesh this thing. So keeping polyframe on, you're seeing the wireframe of the model, what dynamesh is doing to it, as well as its polygroup. So by default, every model basically has an automatic base polygroup. If you go to brush, let's say we just insert something randomly. So I'll take maybe another sphere as an example. Let's turn on symmetry just as well. So you see this has a separate polygroup. So it recognizes it as having a unique group. And if I control click and clear the mask, when you insert, basically you have masking applied to the base mesh or base subtool that you've drawn onto, and when you clear the mask, you clear the masking. If dynamesh mode is active, clear the same function of clearing your mask, which is control left click and drag or control Wacom pen drag, will actually merge these two surfaces together. So now you can sculpt them. And what's great about this is that you can blend these surfaces in a little better, create some other unique sculpting, for example, so you can start to do something unique there. And that's really powerful. The other great thing about this is that it can keep the polygrouping. So maybe later on you want to create some clean topology based on the separation or change from one polygroup to the next. You can do that very, very quickly. Now, as a little side note, if you lose this functionality, that could occur because of this function here. So that could occur because the little paint icon, polypaint icon, is turned on. And so if you dynamesh this, it can actually reset your polygroups and just give you one giant group. So you may want to just check for that if you've clicked it by accident. I find it very easy to do that. Now in this case, I'm going to pretend like I don't have polygroups. So a quick shortcut to get either to wipe out all polygroups is to make sure your entire subtool is visible. Hit Control W. That basically assigns one polygroup to the entire mesh. Now, what you can do, so I'm just going to clean up this character's feet since it's bugging me, so I'm going to just clip curve that very quickly. So what I often like to do is I will often, at a certain stage in sculpting, we're just pretending this character is basically polished and ready for production, but I often like to basically create polygroups where there's major joints, or so from the shoulder area to the elbow, I'll make a polygroup. From the elbow to the wrist, I'll make a polygroup. Each individual finger should get at least one large polygroup, and oftentimes when there's a bend or a joint in the finger, I'll create additional polygroups. So we have another very powerful tool in ZBrush, which if we go to geometry on the right side here, and we go to ZRemesher, what this allows you to do is go from a disorganized dynamesh like this, which has lots of little triangles and polygons that are again kind of messy, and gives us something that could be animation ready with very few clicks. So just literally by clicking this ZRemesh button, we can go from a disorganized mesh to something that's a lot cleaner and, like I said, something that's more animation capable. And what's great about this is that the Keep Groups button, this button here, when you activate it, when it uses polygroups, it'll keep the polygroups from your dynamesh version of the model to a more production ready mesh. And like I said, when you have a transition from one polygroup to the next, it'll give you nice clean loops in those transition spots. So I've got two ways to basically create these groups. One way is to create polygroups, I should say. One way is to control click and drag on a model, then hit Control W. That creates a grouping. Now I'm going to undo twice just so I can go back. If you're control clicking and dragging from off the model, you get a rectangular selection. So oftentimes what I like to do is switch the type of brush I'm using. So I would hold Control, and you can see over on the left side here, it changes my whatever brush I was using. In this case, I was using clay buildup. When I hold Control, it switches to mask pen. So while you're holding Control, if you click on mask pen, you can switch to things like mask lasso, mask curve, mask rectangle, mask square. So for me, the lasso works great. So I can control click and drag, come through here, try to get a decent view on this, and then I can say hit Control W. Also, I should mention when you're switching material types, I often like to either work in flat or skin shade to really see kind of through the mesh. And if you don't want to see the wireframe, for example, if it's distracting, on the polyframe button you can just click on the little line option, or vice versa. If you just want to focus on the wireframe and not the polygroups, you can turn off the fill color, so you just get kind of the wireframe on top of the mesh. Now, at a certain point, you know, the masking aspect doesn't always do me justice, and ZRemesher has another functionality. So when you hold Control-Shift, I believe by default it's set to be select rectangle. So what that select rectangle does, it's sort of similar to masking in a way, but it's actually making certain parts of the mesh visible and invisible. So Control-Shift left click and drag, or Control-Shift Wacom pen drag will allow you to make this, whatever's within this region, visible, and if you hold Alt, it'll make it invisible. It'll hide it. To get everything back in terms of visibility, Control-Shift click off the model, everything comes back. And it's especially built to work with polygroups. So if you Control-Shift click on this polygroup, it'll isolate that group. Control-Shift click on it again, and it inverts the visibility. And then if you Control-Shift click a third time off of the model, it will bring visibility back on everything. So again, much like I did with the masking brush, I like to hold Control-Shift, and you'll see it switch to select rectangle here on the left side. I'm going to click on that, and I often like to go to select lasso. Now, what I've also done, this is a custom interface, and I've also got custom shortcuts. So if you notice, when I hover over the standard button, there's a number 1 next to it. The dam standard has a 2. Move has a 3. So I can quickly switch to these brushes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? 6 is snake hook, 7 is inflate. I believe 8 is my move topological. 0 is clip curve, and 9 is select lasso. I actually prefer it to the select rectangle because it allows me to get into much tighter areas and have more fine-tuned control over my selection. And I often do this polygroup creation either through, as I mentioned, masking, or through kind of visibility. So remember what I said before, Control click and drag. Oops, that was a Shift click and drag. Control click and drag, and then Control W gives you a polygroup. Let me clear that mask. And if I Control Shift click, let's say on this area, and then Control Shift click and drag to, let's say, isolate or just make only the forearms visible to the wrists, if I hit Control W based on visibility now, I can make a new polygroup. So again, 2 ways to make polygroups: based on visibility or based on masking. So what can be interesting too is that, let's say I Control Shift click on the body. Sometimes this will happen. It'll hide a loop, which can be useful sometimes, but in this case I still want to just isolate that section. So you want to try to make sure, if you can, to click on a face and not an edge. When you click on an edge, it'll try to take out a continuous loop. So it's one thing that's a little frustrating, but it just takes a little bit of awareness to control that. Now, one other thing you can do, I've got this button that I brought up from the Polygroups menu on the lower left side called Auto Groups. So if you don't have my interface, what you can do is go to Polygroups, and there's something called Auto Groups. So what it does is it detects that there are separate groups, or sort of separate sections of mesh that are visible and not connected through the visibility. They're still connected as mesh, but visibly, in visibility terms, they're not sort of visible together. So let's say I'm going to just roughly take the head, hit Control W, and now when I isolate this, so it's still technically part of one group. If I do auto groups, now each side, right, each hand has its own group, and now the body has its own group. So now I can isolate just the body. So yeah, when I accidentally, isolate or hide a strip, I will often just hit Control Z to undo and then get back to where I need to be. So as I said, I'm trying to focus on basically areas. So the head, for example, I should mention this as well. Let me turn off the line for a second so you can see this. So these shoulder areas and the head look like the same color, but they're actually slightly different. And the way to confirm if they're in the same polygroup or not is to simply Control-Shift-Click on one. And then if you want to just, for visibility's sake, hit Control-W again just to make sure you have a different color to help you in visibility terms. That can be very useful. So the way I'm setting this particular character up is I'm planning actually to kind of create a very quick, what's known as a Sushi rig. So I want to create a lower res mesh than the 30,000, 40,000 polys that I have now. And I basically want to create separate chunks of the model where the bones will eventually go for animation. And I'll talk a bit about that process, the splitting and exporting to Maya. So I do want to kind of focus on animation important areas. So oftentimes areas like the hips, we want them to kind of come in at an angle, something like so. Let me just hide this little kind of crotch section here. And I can, again, if I wanted to, I could just quickly go to auto groups. So now the torso is, again, it's kind of isolated. And a lot of, for cartoonier animation, you often have between 3 and maybe 5 or 6 bone sections. So let's just say we have a very basic set of bones here for cartoony animation that I'm going to set up. So I'm going to divide it into roughly 3 equal sections or polygroups. So I'll select one, Control-W, Control-Shift-Click to isolate, and again, Control-W. So now we've got 3 sort of bands for the torso. Again, anywhere where there's a major joint, I like to sort of split and isolate. So Control-Shift-Click and drag, Control-W. So around the hips, into the buttock area, in the knees, the ankles, those are good areas to isolate. So I'll kind of come through here, the ankle, Control-W, and then isolate at the ball of the foot as well, right? And for fingers, if you're just doing a first pass, by the way, if you take a look at this, I did some really bad masking here. I didn't quite get the angle that I wanted in the wrist. It's kind of going off on a weird angle. So what I would do is just try to quickly isolate these other groups. And now I'll just hold Control-Shift-Alt to hide the rest here. And I would hit Control-W to reset the polygroups here. And now I can do this from maybe a better POV on this. So I'll Control-Shift-Click and drag, and in this case I'm going to work into the hand, so I'm actually going to subtract this part. So this will be a new polygroup, and again, for a first pass, you could sort of stick to just one finger at a time if you like. So I'll say Control-W. I got to be very careful too about my selections here. So Control-W, then I'll just kind of grab the thumb, Control-W. Now, like I said, what you could do if you really want to try to get more precise is to say, okay, let's kind of go to that knuckle, hit Control-W, Control-Shift-Click and drag again to the next knuckle, Control-W, and then you got, right, 3 polygroups for each. For this first pass, like I said, just 1 polygroup per finger is fine. But again, if you want to maybe save yourself time and sort of jump ahead, especially if you feel like your fingers and hands are in a good spot, you can proceed kind of to this step. So I'll just quickly get that in there just to show, again, the process. I also have a base mesh hand that you can use. So if you did want to, I should fix this hand grouping as well. It's not the greatest. So I'll hit Control-W for that. And Control-W, and then just, I think, one more here, Control-W. Now, like I said, if you've got kind of messy, sloppy selections, you can try to fix that. So I may just hide these two for now. So I'm just Control-Shift-Clicking to hide the areas that I may want to clean up. And now I can just Control-Shift with the lasso, right, select everything else, and just make sure nothing else is left behind, no tiny little bits of mesh. So I'll hit Control-W. Something else people often do with the hands is they often split them kind of top to bottom, so the top side is separate from the bottom side. So you could split those into two halves if you like, but again, this is something that can be done a bit later on. Let's go back to our wireframe. So just some quick settings or things to note in ZRemesher. So I'm going back to the geometry panel, back to ZRemesh. I will turn on keep groups. There's an adapt function. Now, the great thing about ZBrush is that anytime you hover over anything in the menu or in the interface and you hold control, it actually tells you exactly what that feature will do. So it's pretty much like having a search function and a manual at your fingertips. So just holding control and hovering over a button. What adapt basically does is that it'll prioritize maintaining the accuracy of the big shapes and the smaller shapes over the poly count that you're listing. So for me, I want something that's going to be more focused on getting a target poly count and core edge loops in and around major joint areas. So I'm turning off the adapt function and turning on keep loops. What I recommend, again, for student films, low budget productions, independent productions, maybe commercials and cartoony stuff, it's a ballpark recommendation, but 5 to 10,000 polys, up to 20,000 for the body, and same sort of poly range for just the head, so 5 to 20,000. Usually, for me personally, if I do 10,000 on the body, I'll do 10,000 on the head. Main reason you put a lot of polys into the face or the head is that that's where most of the expression and the main parts of the character where you're going to get close-ups. So you'll often need more concentration of texture and mesh detail in those areas. So next up, I've turned back on the line option so we can see what's going to happen with the mesh. I'm going to go to ZRemesh. And if your poly count is very high, this will be a lot slower. So if you have a very, very high poly count, it will take longer to process, but this process fairly quickly. Now, what's also great about this is that sometimes if you get some really ugly, weird topology in certain areas, you can try to smooth it out a bit. And then just say, let's keep the same poly count. It's around 9,000 polys. I'm not too upset about that. I'll say same poly count right here. If you wanted to double it or half it, you can do that as well. I find this going to half, same, or double, if you get a decent poly count range that you're happy with, or that you want to go in half, or you want to double, this gets a little more accurate than just using the slider. So if I ZRemesh again, this should come out a little bit cleaner loop-wise, and you can see it's much, much nicer than the previous results. So that's kind of just a basic rundown of using ZRemesher and Polygroups. There are a lot more features to ZRemesher that you can delve into. There are things like curves, so you would basically draw curves on the model. I can show you that quickly, but lately I've been focusing my ZRemeshing work on just simply using the Polygroups, which I find immensely powerful. Now, as a final note, if you need to send this out to a software like Blender or Maya, 3D Max, or some other animation package, as I mentioned earlier, for a sushi rig, where you basically are just taking floating pieces of the mesh and then linking them to your sort of early phase rigs, what you can do is actually go into Subtool. I'm going to go to Split, and you can basically either do a group split, so it'll take objects of the same polygrouping and split those, or you can even just say split to parts. So if you need to do left finger, right finger, left hand, left upper arm, right upper arm, and so on, you can basically do that through here. So you could say group split. I'll show you right away. So if we do group split, it's undoable. It says it's undoable, which is another sort of flaw I find with this system. But let me just do a quick save as. I'll save it on my desktop for now, so I can reload that quickly. So if I go to Subtool and do a group split, like I said, any sides that are left-right that have the same grouping will be preserved into one group. So that can be useful. If you need each left and right leg, left and right arm, left and right fingers to be separate and isolated for the purpose of doing something like a sushi rig, what you can actually do is go into just simply split to parts. So it actually recognizes the groupings. I'll just say OK. Should be working. Split to parts. Oh, sorry, I made a mistake here actually. Yeah, split to parts actually is going to look at just floating mesh on top, not actually at the polygroup. So you can try split to similar parts, but that's basically going to do something similar to group split. But again, that's for floating mesh. So I'll just do a simple group split. And now, if you've got Go Z set up, so to do that, you can go into Preferences, Go Z, and make sure you have whatever your software of choice is, you know, Cinema 4D, 3D Max, Maya. I'm just going to make sure my Maya scripts are installed. So I'm going to go to Preferences and Force Reinstall. And now if you simply say, let's send all tools over, this will take each and every separate subtool, and now you basically have a very quick and convenient way to essentially start linking these things together, just doing a straight up either flooded skinning or even just doing direct parenting to all your bones, and to start getting a kind of test version of your character skinned, rigged, and ready to animate. So it's a very, very powerful function. Something else to mention as well, I'll just come back to this particular creature as well, or this sculpt, is that if you want to unwrap something, you can also go to Z plugin, UV master, and go to polygroups, and then just quickly say unwrap, and it's amazing. It basically takes each one of these little shell pieces and turns it into a flattened UV island. Now when you're working on this, you should always try to go work on clone, so it actually makes a little snapshot copy of this mesh. So it'll be called something like CL for clone, CL, and then the file name. And I usually like to just go and flatten this, and you can see all the shells. They're packed. They're basically fairly well laid out. So that's kind of an ingenious part of the system, is it really just, you know, sends you so much further along in the production process. I'm back here just for the last little bit of this video. So what you've got now are, as I've mentioned, the separated polygroups of your mesh. So since I'm dealing with Maya, if you are, you know, wanting to link these, parent these, or sort of just skin each individual piece directly to a bone, what you could do, and I should probably turn off symmetry here, so we'll turn off any symmetry. So you could take one side and basically double click the poly area. It should go to the continuous area of that mesh, and then you can actually just shift right click and say extract, and that will basically split that off into its own unique object. So now you've got something that you can kind of link together, parents and all that sort of stuff.